This release event that you're about to watch footage from was a bit different than most. If you went to a release event in your area, you likely played with Jinx, Viktor, and Lee Sin. However, here in Australia, Viktor product hasn't arrived yet, so our release events have been a little bit different. Our release events feature just Jinx and Lee Sin, and after opening up all of my packs, my deck looked like this. The key cards felt like they were all the removal and pseudo-removal pieces that I had, like Gust and Voidseeker, and this game is a perfect example of how important these cards were throughout the event. Game number 1, I choose Zorn Warrens into my opponent's Targon's Peak. I win the die roll and start the game off with Pouty Poro. The opponent also has their own Poro on their turn, however she's going to be using specifically the Stalwart Poro and buffing it with Lee Sin's ability. The next turn, I develop Tide Turner after conquering at Targon's Peak, choosing to move the Pouty Poro back to base where it's a little bit safe, and by the time my turn ends, I have 4 runes ready to go for the opponent's turn. She decides to push her buffed Poro into my Tide Turner, and in response, I Gust. That bounces it back to her hand, and then she chooses to play the Poro again and develops her Mistfall. I take a point for holding, and I push my Pouty Poro to Zorn Warrens. I decided to discard Voidseeker. Now, Voidseeker is a really premium card, so this should be a sign to my opponent and to you, the viewer, that my hand is quite strong if I'm willing to give up a Voidseeker. Probably means I have a good amount of interaction in my hand as well. I develop the Blazing Scorcher in base and return Tide Turner before passing to the opponent, with a pretty strong setup in my base. She decides to move her Stalwart Poro up to Targon's Peak, taking her first point. She then goes for Reinforce, looking at the top 5 cards of her deck for a unit to play. She gets a Wildclaw Shaman, and decides to buff that Wildclaw Shaman with Lee Sin's ability and passes. I go to 4 for holding, and instantly push Targon's Peak with my Blazing Scorcher. At this point, my opponent realizes that they forgot to ready 2 runes for Targon's, which is also a step that I didn't notice she missed, and I didn't even notice, so we just let her ready those runes. This was a surprise to me in the moment, because again, like I said, I didn't realize either, but I probably would have pushed the Blazing Scorcher regardless of whether she had 3 or 1 rune up, so it's not a big deal, didn't have an impact on the game, just took me a moment to adjust. She goes for a challenge, targeting the Blazing Scorcher with her Wildclaw Shaman, the result being a trade with the Poro, and also the Wildclaw Shaman dying. I didn't mind this at all, because really my Blazing Scorcher effectively went 1 for 3 here, draining the opponent's challenge, Stalwart Poro, and Wildclaw Shaman. After that showdown, I move up my Tide Turner for the 5th point and bring my Pouty Poro back to base for safety. Next, I take the time to develop Magma Worm in my base, which felt like a bit of a checkmate for opponent, because from my POV, it's looking pretty likely that Magma Worm is going to be able to ready up next turn, completely unharmed from whatever the opponent does on their turn. This turns out to be correct because the opponent takes a turn to develop Wizened Elder and buffs him, uses Mistfall to ready the unit, and then pushes the Wizened Elder into Targon's Peak. I don't respond, the Elder walks over my Tide Turner and she takes her 2nd point and develops a Clockwork Keeper at Targon's Peak. I move up to Zorn Warrens, take my 6th point, discarding Scrap Heap and drawing 2, 1 for Zorn and 1 for Scrap Heap. Then I develop a 2nd Magma Worm. I could theoretically push the Magma Worm into Targon's Peak, but there are a handful of cards that could result in completely blowing me out of the game, and there's absolutely no reason for me to risk this right now. While I have the point lead, why am I fighting over the 7th point when I could just get the 7th point next turn and the 8th point? Not to mention, even without the opponent using any interaction, if I push both of my Magma Worms here for the 7th point, I'm going to lose one of them. She holds Targon's Peak and goes to 3 points, developing Lee Sin Chosen Champion at the same battlefield. One thing I found really interesting here is that she asked for a count of my discard pile, so perhaps she was trying to count for Vi or Raza being readied by Magma Worm, especially because either of those 2 cards would be readied by Magma Worm as well, which honestly made me scared on my turn because I was wondering if she was even considering that. She must have a response for it. She ends up using Charm on the first Magma Worm, pulling it up to Targon's Peak. So unfortunately I am down 1 Magma Worm, but at least we do get to chip away at that setup. So it's a little bit weaker for our crackback on next turn. But none of this particularly matters because after that Charm, she decides to go to game 2, probably not having an answer for the 2nd Magma Worm and not having enough to hold that point on her turn, or sorry, on my turn. In game 2, our opponent goes first and unfortunately has to pass turn 1. It's a big win for me because if she gets a tempo advantage here, it's going to be hard for me to claw back, especially in this Jinx versus Lee Sin format. Jinx just wants to get an early lead and then maintain that lead. If Lee Sin is the one with the early lead, it's kind of hard for Jinx to recover, I think. I have a fine start to the game, not ideal, but it's fine. I drop a Chemtech Enforcer, discarding Scrap Heap to draw a card. Her turn 2 is much stronger than her first turn, developing a Wizened Elder and passing. I push the Enforcer into Grove of the Godwiller, developing Traveling Merchant and passing with 3 runes up, representing a Void Seeker. The opponent does play around Void Seeker, buffing up their Wizened Elder and then pushing the Enforcer, but I actually had Get Excited, another MVP of the format. Opponent goes for a Discipline to try to pump Wizened Elder out of range of the Get Excited. Wizened Elder now representing 8 Might, which does resolve and she does get to draw her card, but the card I discarded is Brazen Buccaneer, dealing 6 damage and taking a trade with the Wizened Elder. This ended up being a pretty intense combat, but it's one that I think ultimately went my way. I won't get a card draw next turn from Grover the Godwillow, but I think that's probably fine given how the rest of the combat turned out for me. Before her turn ends, she develops a first mate in base. I almost end up moving my Traveling Merchant to Reaver's Row, but I decided to go to the Godwillow instead, discarding Scrap Heap from Merchant's effect and drawing a total of 2 cards, one for Scrap Heap and one for Merchant. More importantly, we also go to 2 point. On opponent's turn, they buff up the first mate and then play Wildclaw Shaman to ready the Wildclaw Shaman, transferring the buff to it. She tries to move the first mate to Reaver's Row, but during the showdown I use Void Seeker to clear it, and then she pushes the Shaman against my Merchant. Luckily, I have a second Void Seeker here. Potentially, the opponent could have assumed that I would have some type of interaction because A, I was willing to pass my turn without spending any runes, but I was also willing to use Void Seeker to prevent her from touching Reaver's Row, which in this situation, I should care a little bit less about Reaver's Row than the battlefield that I already have a unit at, so it's likely I'm not afraid of losing the Merchant because I have more interaction, but it's hard to put me on exactly 2 Void Seekers this early in the game, especially in a limited format. Before she ends her turn, she does end up developing a Clockwork Keeper. You'll notice that on this turn, I take the time to count my discard pile. This is because I'm doing math to figure out how much Raza costs right now. I move the Merchant back to keep him safe, but I also get to discard and draw, discarding Gust while my opponent's Clockwork Keeper is in base, another good tell or another good sign that I probably have a lot of interaction in my hand if I'm willing to give up a Gust in this situation. I pay 2 to play Chemtech Enforcer, discarding Fight or Flight, even more interaction than I was willing to give up, probably because I have even more in my hand, and I pass with 4 up while at 3 points. I had the foresight to flash my hand to the camera here because I knew I was going to want to talk about it. Gust, Rebuke, Get Excited, and Raza. I value the Get Excited Raza combo in this champion format because it's one of the only answers I'm ever going to have to Lee Sin Mountain Drakes. Plus, I have the Gust and the Rebuke. Gust for their Clockwork Keeper, and Rebuke for potentially accelerated Lee Sin. She moves up the Clockwork Keeper, and of course I respond with the planned Gust, and then she goes for the accelerated Lee Sin, which ultimately gets rebuked, exactly as calculated. A frustrating from Lee Sin's point of view, of course, but she takes the time to develop Clockwork Keeper and passes back to me. I move up the Merchant, discarding Chompers I just drew and floating in energy. Then I move up the Enforcer to go to my 5th point. You might have noticed I value the Merchant being able to abuse the Reaver's Row trigger more than actually protecting the Chemtech Enforcer's +2 while attacking. I pass back to the opponent while still holding that Get Excited combo discussed in my hand earlier with 5 runes up, so I'm feeling pretty safe. She starts by using Lee Sin to buff up the Clockwork Keeper and moves into Godwillow. I let her have this just because the only interaction I have that can actually beat the Clockwork Keeper in this position is my Get Excited combo, and I don't want to give up my Get Excited combo. I actually love to see that she's doing this. It's really cool. This is the only opponent I had all weekend that was actually taking time to keep track of this type of thing, and I'm really excited to see as players get more comfortable with the game, them starting to do more things like this. She decided to accelerate Lee Sin, pushing it to Reaver's Row. I'm confident I can make this combat go my way, so I skip the Reaver's Row trigger, and then first action is on her. She goes for Challenge, using it to target my Merchant with her Clockwork Keeper, and then I decide to use Get Excited to clear the Lee Sin, discarding Raza. I push my Flame Chompers to Reaver's Row to go to 6, and then I use Fading Memories to give Clockwork Keeper temporary so that it will die at the beginning of its turn. I did this instead of accelerating out the Chosen Champion Jinx because I know I'm going to be more likely to need her to close out the game on the next turn instead of fighting for that 7th point. Again, the 7th point does not matter as much as the 6th and 8th. Opponent's best line in this kind of checkmate situation was just putting down Mountain Drake and Poro, but then she realizes that on the next turn I'll just accelerate out the Jinx and close out the game, so she decides to concede. It was a really rough game from Lee Sin's perspective, but it was just because I was able to abuse these really high power level interaction cards that prevent her from setting up on a battlefield. Like I kind of insinuated earlier, the player with the lead in the early turns of the game in these decks when both players are playing correctly, I think the Jinx just gets to steamroll away, especially if she has access to those Gusts, the Rebukes, the Fight Flights. It's all really disruptive to Lee Sin's big unit gameplay style. I think if you went back and looked at this game in particular and tried to determine what turn made the difference, I think the Chosen Champion getting rebuked the first time around, that is probably the deciding or the outcome determinative turn. Without Windwall, Lee Sin can't really do much about that, so it's really just Jinx's games to lose if that happens. I've got one more game from this event that I'm going to post sometime this week. Let me know if you like this format so I can continue to do it. Thank you so much for watching, keep being awesome, and I'll catch you in the next one.